Thank you for the introduction, Patrick. Hope everyone's well, and thank you for inviting me. Thank you to you and Andrew as well. It's a pleasure to be here. I really want to give an insight into our club and really what's happened in terms of the return to physical performance after COVID-19 and how we use GPS and heart rate to monitor our training. The approach here is quite unique. We are a small club trying to achieve big things in Europe, so hopefully it gives an insight into what we do at the club in terms of the tactical periodisation model and how the data fits around that, and then I'll sort of tie in the COVID and how that variation in the training load varied when we came back after the long time off. I apologise for my Scottish. If you can't make me out, just put it on the question and I'll try and slow down, although I know there's a few Scottish boys listening. Okay, so I want to start with a performance statement, and this is really, I've been here for 2 years, and it relates to our game model and essentially how the team play when we play at home and away and when we play in Europe. And it's really, in attack, we really want to play aggressive possession football based in creating short passing triangles to create numerical superiority, changing of players' positions to identify space, and look to break the lines of defence with creativity. In defence, we will press high in the right moments and be compact plus patient when required. And a big thing is player intelligence and individuality are part of the game model structure. And that's really my insight into the game model here for being here the 2 years. And I like to start presentation with that, because that for me really drips into the data and the physical outcomes for the team and really should guide the process for every coach at the club. So I think in this time in COVID, really we have to look and go back to what human performance actually is in sport and what affects human performance in sport. And that's really where I started after the COVID break. We had, I think it was 10 weeks out here before we come back into pre-season, which was longer. It was actually a 6-week pre-season. We normally have a 3-week pre-season. So before we come back, I went back to the sort of basics of physiology and sport and what really affects human performance in sport. So these are the questions I sort of asked: the sport environment, the athlete status, the physiological level, the coaching process, the strength and conditioning exposure, the individual approach, and then long-term athlete development. And before I constructed the pre-season this year, they were the questions I tried to answer before looking at the pre-season in detail. And then really, can we measure sporting performance and development? Why, what, and how are crucial to that process. So this gives you a sort of insight. This is a player data display. This is the team here. The names are obviously blacked out. I hope you can see on the screen the writing is a bit small, but really we tried to give the coach a snapshot of where our players are at that moment in time. We look at the coach's status, so are they in the starting 11, the squad 20, or outside the squad? The game capacity, can they deal with total distance, high intensity and sprint? Can they compete in 40 games in a season? And can they consistently compete in 2 to 3 games over a week? We then look at the training capacity. So in a daily training capacity, can they tolerate high training sessions, moderate, low? Can they tolerate weekly accumulation and monthly accumulation? We then look at recovery strategies, hydration, which Tom mentioned before, the post-match nutrition. What is their strategy? Is it good? Is it bad? The recovery process, what did they use? The medical history, again, which other practitioners have mentioned on the webinar, where they are they at moderate risk, at high risk, or low risk? And then we look at a sort of testing bank there, the sports science. So the yo-yo, speed, agility, power jumps. We then look at body composition, and then what we do in terms of nutrition, what are they doing individually, and how are we monitoring that for them? And then we look at sports science goals, and that correlates to the gym. So this is a one-sheet snapshot of our team and where they are at that moment in time. In behind this is all the data that answers these questions on the first page. But it's really to give you an insight of what that looks like at our team. So after COVID-19, our football team performance and how was it affected? So really, it was negatively affected, and how we assess that in terms of performance in football, we have to take into consideration a lot of factors, and the ability of the club and players to return to maximum level dependent planning. But that is uncharted territory for the clubs and the practitioners, which has been mentioned again by Tom in the last presentation. However, we must see this as an opportunity to build new culture, training regimes, that might well change the way that we train our players in the future. So at the centre here, I put the football and the team player performance, and around it, what affects that performance. So technically and tactically, their ability, it wasn't being trained in COVID. They were in their house primarily. They could only go out for short periods of time. They went with a trainer. They weren't touching the ball. They certainly weren't working tactical elements. They weren't inside a coaching environment because they're on their own. The player's physical status would be lowering, so it starts to go amber. The player's psychological status, you could suggest, was going down, and again, amber. The club environment and culture was negatively affected because they weren't inside the club and, again, the coaching environment. And individual and long-term development needs weren't being met, so again, that would turn to amber. Essentially, all these corners of performance should be green, like the centre, but you can see here I colour-coded them to give an insight into the club, where the team was when they returned after COVID-19. So how do we tackle that? So again, I went back to a physical player performance profile model. This is a model I used previously at Celtic and have adopted it here for Ludogorets. And I look at sort of 5 key areas. So repeated sprintability is a match-winning component. VO2 kinetics and anaerobic threshold gives us the game intensity that we want to play at. Speed is match-winning component. High velocity accelerations and deaccelerations is match-winning. And change of direction is obviously match-winning as well. But how that fits into a pyramid of performance model. So we can see here at the bottom, all the components that really come together to make that performance profile physically for the player. So you can have a look at the aerobic strength, movements, fundamental, power, anaerobic, change of direction, agility, speed, rate of force and development. But essentially what we want to do in the top of the tree is repeat those efforts and combine those qualities together to create football actions. And always not forgetting education and the mindset of the player. And as I mentioned, all components must integrate and complement the technical and tactical model. And I've put that in red because we're speaking about physical here, and I'm a sports scientist, but I think it's key for me and something I've learned over the last 3 or 4 years that we really must speak in the terminology of the coaches, and Tom did touch on that again himself, but we really must understand the game model. We must understand football. We must understand football actions to put in the physical components that relate to the player's position, the game model, and we can speak to the coaches. So what we had to do after COVID was essentially rebuild the player. So taking the last slide in that performance model and really starting to build it again. So we're looking again at our fundamental movements. What did we do? 3 areas here: athletic patterns and movements, neuro introduction, proprioception. We looked at aerobic base, mechanical load in terms of running because they're in the house, they were on their bike, developing the VO2 and the kinetics. We looked at anaerobic introduction, mechanical load of anaerobic, and developing anaerobic threshold again. We looked at strength, building the movement introduction, so stripping it right back, going back to foundation strength before introducing speed strength. We then brought in our power movements, so again, just an introduction of power and the movement introduction, and then bring in the explosive power. We looked at speed because they haven't been running at high velocities and high kilometers per hour. So we had to introduce that. We then introduced game movement and then maximal speed. And then change direction again, just introduction, bringing in game movements, and then maximal changes of direction. And then rate of force development they weren't doing in COVID time. So introduction, maximal efforts, and then be able to repeat it. And then, as I said in the last model, we need to repeat those efforts and combine those qualities into football actions. So we basically had to rebuild the player from the ground up and build the pyramid again. So the training week by week after COVID, these were generally the outcomes that I identified for the club, the coach and the players. If you look along the top, you'll see week 1 to 5, and then what we did in terms of running, heart rate, total distance, the tactical component, the technical component, and then what we were doing, either strength or power. And you can see there's an accumulation effect. There's a change each week in terms of the training intensity, the training load, and the parameters that we're trying to hit. In week 5, we go into what I would consider our normal sort of training week, the tactical periodization, where we start to reduce the load, and it's a high content of tactical and technical coaching. So essentially for 4 weeks, we tried to build the athlete back up to where they were post-COVID and prepare them for our normal tactical periodization model in preparation for the end of the season. So I did a quick analysis for you in terms of the pre-season under COVID, which was 6 weeks, and the normal pre-season for us, which is 3 weeks. So if you look down the left-hand side, what was in the performance physical model, you had the fundamental movements, your aerobic, the anaerobic, your high intensity sprint, and your strength and power, and where that actually fell into the weeks pre-season. Now, if you look at normal, we didn't do any. We'd never normally do fundamental movements. The aerobic base, as Tom said, is a key space to do in the off-season. We would come straight back in and go into anaerobic threshold training because we know the levels of the players in a normal pre-season. We would introduce high-intensity running the first week, and then week 2 we're straight into sprinting. Strength for me is never done in season, pre-season. It's always done off-season if players need topped up. And then power for me starts in week 1. And if you look at COVID, it was week 3. So a big variation in terms of analysis of the pre-season. So I mentioned tactical periodization and what a normal physical periodization would look like. You've seen this before, and other practitioners will presented this as well. So your basic strength, endurance, speed, and focus, and you can see in the top right how the periodization looks in terms of intensity. And really, again, hitting home what Tom had mentioned before, the intensity is a major factor. So if you look at your training volume, but what's key to that is how intense that volume is. Match day minus 1, 2, 3, and 4. And I'll come back to that and touch more on it. So what is really tactical periodization, and how does it fit into the physical periodization model, which I like the term as a performance model that we use at the club. There's many variations of this performance model, and I'm not saying tactical periodization is the be-all and end-all, but for me, my experience of tactical periodization with the physical model is really, for me, a high-level performance model. You've seen this before, the sub-sub principles and match day minus 4, match day minus 3 collective principles, match day minus 2 sub-principles, match day minus 1 collective principles. You'll see how that relates to pitch size, nothing new there. And down the bottom is the loading factor, so the physical periodization down the bottom in terms of volume, durations, work-rest ratios. So what do we consider while trying to create and build this model in terms of the drills that we use? So weekly, monthly, yearly. Tactical periodization is the main focus and the center point of what we do. So the tactical principle will rule the weekly, monthly, and yearly planning. The physical periodization will fit around that. We'll then interlink and speak with players in terms of the specific individual player needs. We then look at how we feed that back in terms of the physical data and the tactical data, which I'll come on to later as well. And then are we looking at development or performance of the team? And that for me is a real key area, because if we're trying to develop a team in a certain area tactically, or are we trying to hit the higher level of performance? And that's very important, how you plan the week, especially physically as well. We speak physically, but I always relate back to tactical in the game model. So every day, these are the sort of 4 elements that we look at: the tactical, the technical, the physiological, and the mindset of the player. And that for us will help create the daily training model. So tactical periodization. So this is what we look at in terms of our club, in terms of collective principles, sub-principles, and sub-sub-principles, both attacking and defending. Now, what's missing in there is the transition. For me, transition is always included within each principle, whether it's attacking or defending. There'll always be a transition. I won't go over these, but you can just see what we use in terms of our club. Again, this is just to give you an oversight, what we consider in terms of a game model. And again, just breaks it down probably a little bit further into the phases of play, and you'll see the transition in the middle there. Okay, so the collective principles. So I want to give you a quick insight into how that looks at our club again. So the second phase of building up, and the coaching principles, the objectives, and the physical outcomes are down the bottom. So you can basically see that the lower phase of building up, our holding midfielder will drop in to make a back 3. And as we progress up the field, that holding midfielder will come into a central point. Our right back will come from a wide position into the central position to create an overload centrally, and we have interchanging of player positions. So how does that look in a match? There's a quick video here just for you to see that. This was against Inter Milan in the last 16 in the Europa League this year. Here you can see we have a back 2. The holding midfielder is now central. We just switch the play out wide. Our full backs are wide. So we're looking for high intensity movements, we're looking for speed, we're looking for balance and coordination, we're looking for strength and agility, technical skill to release the ball wide, we're looking for concentration and mentality to get in the box, strength, and to score a goal. So it's really just to sum up our play at this club. Okay, so how we break that down into training, this is against Espanyol, and all I really want to highlight is the 4 blue circles in the centre here, and how we put that into a training drill and tactical periodisation. So this slide will show you a drill created for the coaches, playing against a line of 4. And this can be used in match day -3, match day -2, or match day -4, depending on the space that you use, the duration you have the drill for, and what intensity you're trying to look for and not overload the players, or are you trying to overload the players. In this, there's a high meters per minute and there's a high heart rate. So defensive line of 4 are working really hard. The players on the outside are circulating the ball quickly, trying to break the lines with the pass. And we have one player inside the area here, trying to link the play. So moving from the front to the back. You can see down the bottom, the line of 4 defending is highlighted for you. You will see a transition in this, probably in about 10 seconds. Where we do lose the ball, the players on the blue will come into the centre and press the ball. So as I said before, we always look at the transition if we lose the ball. So depending on the intensity you want to create within each drill, relating back to your game model, it's important now, lose the ball, transition, players on the outside in to try and win the ball back, and the ball goes out. Okay. So tactical and physical periodisation we spoke about. This is the first model that we would use. So if match day is a Saturday or Sunday, if you're Saturday or Sunday, we have 2 recovery days. We then go into our smaller areas, our bigger areas, our medium-sized areas, and then the day before can be medium and large, depending on the coach. So how that looks, there's then a variation in that model for me, which is not probably the typical tactical periodisation, depending on the coach. We may have 2 recovery days, 2 large days, large field, and then down into a tactical recovery day, and then match day -1, the same as before. So as I said, we do collect data. It's important on the tactical side as well to give the coaches feedback. So Monday through to Sunday, with the game being on the Saturday. So this is our game model broken down on the left, and it's time spent in each drill and each part of the game model, and what percentage of that we're spending over the week. And I think this is really important because you can tie this in with our physical data, our heart rate data, and speak to the coach, as said, in his terminology, and really understand what they want to do in terms of their team. They're the ones that are responsible, and we're the ones that help guide them through the process if we can. So for me, this was vital to give them the feedback on the tactical side as well, and how that can impact the physical, you know, for suggestions like, can we spend more time in this area? Do you want to spend more time doing this? How will this affect the physical load for the week? So speaking about the physical load, this is the periodization of average data broken down into positions. So this is for total distance average, and down the bottom is average player RPE. So this is a rating from 1 to 10, 10 being the highest. Okay, so you can see the different positions, how they change throughout the week. And interesting to note on this is in match day -2, specific to this club here, is our wide defenders look at the distance in match day -2 compared to a midfielder. Now that is because the combination play or pattern of play drill that we use, we reduce the load for the wide defenders, because in our game model in the match, we expect our wide defenders to run an average of 300 meters per match. So our discussion with the coach is, can we design a pattern of play or combination play where our wide defenders don't have to do an overlap? It's the wide midfielders who are doing the action, and save some energy, match day -2, to take into the game. Again, that will be highlighted again in high intensity here. If you look at match day -2, only 55 meters for our wide defenders compared to our wide midfielders, 158. So small things that show you variation in physical periodization for players, and every club will be different. The error bar here is our 10%. So we look at 10% above or below for that training day, for position. We can then break it down individually and give the coach feedback if we feel one player has gone beyond or over and above what they would normally do or the expectation. We use STATSports Apex, so we use the live system to monitor and give feedback constantly to the coaches, especially if it's a new drill or the coach wants to increase the training load for that day. We just simply give them the feedback and maybe suggest, look, you've increased the physical load for today, but maybe that's enough. It's gone beyond our 10%, which we think is acceptable. Or if you want to continue, we really need to make sure that he recovers tomorrow or that position recovers tomorrow or even the squad. So the periodisation may change for the week, but this is average data. You can see match day -3 where the sprint data comes in. So over 100 for every position. Again, this looks at explosive distance just to show you the periodisation, which is nice and neat for each position. And down below is average acceleration and deacceleration data as well. And again, with your 10% averages. So again, you can definitely see a periodisation effect in terms of the physical load for the players. This is in a normal setting. So how did this vary in terms of COVID? As I said at the start, we'll touch on that. So this was our physical periodisation model for COVID. So completely different to the models you've seen before and completely different to a normal pre-season for me. So we did aerobic the first week. We did 4 sessions aerobic. I think in every pre-season I've done, I've never done 4 aerobic pre-season, sessions in 1 week. So with that, we had 2 aerobic, 2 down days, which one was a tactical game model programming, a day off, and then we repeat that cycle. Week 2, we moved to anaerobic, and it was the same cycle, 2 down, 2, and 1 back up. So this was completely different. Normally we would go into a normal tactical periodization model that I've shown you in the previous slides, but due to COVID, we completely changed, reassessed, and looked at human performance, as I said before, and trying to build that athlete back up. And you can see week 1, 2 strength sessions, week 2, 2 strength sessions, and then week 3, we brought in power. But I would just give you the first 2 weeks to get an example and an overview. So in COVID, day by day, we looked at average. And this first one, the top one, is average for total distance. You can see where we peak, where we had double session on the 19th. We had an AM and PM session. We dropped down. We started to build back up. We had our first match against Levski, and all the 9,500 average data, total distance for our matches. But you can see the start very, very low. Days off, as I said, as suggested in the last slide, not big distances, start to build up, start to accumulate in week 3, and then we really start to bring it down before the first league match again. And then if you look during the matches, it's very, very low. Again, accelerations, deaccelerations follow the same sort of format as your total distance in terms of volume. And then this slide shows the high intensity distance and sprint distance. Now, if you remember, the first week we didn't do, the first 2 weeks was no sprint, which you can clearly see down the bottom in the day-by-day average. At the top, you can see week 2 we brought in the high intensity, and week 3 we peaked with a 522 and a 503. And then it was pretty steady throughout the days. You can see where we did our high intensity collective principal days when it was over 200 for average for the squad. And you can see down the bottom in terms of our sprint, where we definitely did our sprint days. So there's normally like a 7 to 8 days in between those sort of average peaks in the sprint with above 100 meters. So very, very clear periodization there. Again, not normal in terms of what would normally happen when the players come back in and only had a 3-week pre-season. Normally after 2 or 3 or 4 days, they would have sprint data and definitely would have high intensity after the second day. So it's very, very different day by day average data than I'm used to. And again, this just rolled into our week by week average data. So you can see total distance, again, peak in week 3, dropping off, bringing back up again and steadying through to week 10. Again, week 3, you'll see the accumulation of the accel, deacceleration. Week 5, an increase again, accel, decel. And then a sort of linear periodization which follows with the total distance. High intensity, again, as we spoke before, week 2 we introduced, start to build up, week 3 we peak. Week 1 and week 2, no sprint data. Week 3 we peak and drop and peak each week. as we go through. Week 9 is where we were trying to win the league, so we increased our sprint capacity and added sprint into the training program then, because we really wanted added repeated sprint to make sure we're ready for those last 2 games to win the league for the 9th time. Heart rate. So this is heart rate I've taken from our last week. You'll see here in July. If we look at Wednesday the 15th through to the 19th, which was yesterday, and you can see the accumulation of the training effect. We look at anaerobic and aerobic contribution within the session. So aerobic is the lighter blue, anaerobic is the darker blue, and you can really see the periodization certainly of the anaerobic and then the peak, which was yesterday. So you can see the training effect in terms of heart rate as well as your GPS. So how do we feed back to the coaches? So this is a daily feedback example for you to look at. This was match day -2, so it's supposed to be a regeneration day. We look at 4 components. We look at team average for meters per minute, team average for accel, decel, team average for heart rate, and we look at team average for RPE. So if we look at the left-hand column is your RPE. Along the middle, from 40 to 130 is your meters per minute. If we look from top to bottom, accel, decel goes from 60 to 200, and our heart rate effect from first beat is 0 to 5. So for each component in terms of physical and tactical periodization, we have an area of average, give or take 10% for each day's target, and we plot the graph based on that. So if we look at the badge here, the Ludogorets badge, you can see the RP was 4.5, the heart rate was 2.5, the average accel decel was 80, and our meters per minute was 62. Now what we will do sometimes, if a player is doing extra or more, or is behind or maybe not playing the weekend and they do extra work, we'll put that player separate to the average data and plot him for the coach to see as well, and his data will show up different. We'll also show outliers, so if a player has done more or maybe done extra work, something they shouldn't have done, what the coach wants to do with them, how that affected their periodization for that day, and we'll just flag them up so the coach knows that post session, so they can take note of that, and we can discuss that in the morning meeting to say maybe this player we have to reduce the next day, especially if it's match day -2, which this example is. So other things to consider for myself was player wellness periodization. So we look at 2 components for me, nice and simple, just to tie it in. It's heart rate variability, which we use with our 3-minute recovery test for the players. This is a percentage from 0 to 100. So you can see here the player progresses through from 30% to 87% on match day. This is taking it every day. Normally we wouldn't do this, but in special consideration in terms of like COVID and the first game back, we tracked it every day for the players. So you can see they fully recovered in match day -3, little bit of fatigue carried into match day -2, recover, and then almost fully recover from match day. The other thing we look at is a player fatigue rating, where the player actually just reports himself how he feels in terms of his own personal fatigue subjective score, and that goes from 0 to 10. You can see there's a nice progression of that through the week as well. So really the key points for me for this in terms of tactical periodization and the physical periodization there, we really want to enhance the game model. We want to provide players with a systematic training model. We want to provide the players with game reference points, allow the players creativity and expression within that, and develop the player and the team. The physical periodization, we want to develop game fitness, limit fatigue and peak for condition. It's a systematic training of the physiological energy systems. We want to limit potential injury through overload, and we want to develop the player and the team. And that for us creates the performance model. So as I said at the start, I really like to tie it in at the end of the presentation with return to performance. And that's really what the key is for me, is how are we performing after COVID or after a normal pre-season. Really, we look at 2 factors at Ludogorets. This is something I created here for the team. And we look at meters per minute in terms of average for the team. And we look at sprint distance total for the team. So we have 2 key physical targets. Meters per minute is 105 for domestic league, and for Europe is 115. Our sprint performance domestically is 1,750, and for Europe is 2,150. And you can see the bottom, these were the games that we played just to win the league. The one game that we draw, we didn't hit the physical targets for the match. So against Ardar, we drew the match, we didn't hit meters per minute, or we didn't hit our sprint performance. The other 4 matches we did. So 4 out of 5 matches we did, which was a great return after the players been off for such a long time. But key points for me is to contextualize the data. It's fundamental that coaches and players have that conversation and understand, yes, this is a data point, it's a physical target, but how does that tie in with our game model? How does it tie in with our high press in terms of meters per minute? How does it tie in with our sprint performance in terms of our overlapping, our underlapping, our players getting into the box, our midfielders supporting, our holding midfielder dropping, then sprinting forward into position? So how does that tie in? We can link those video clips via STATSports, and we can also do a notation analysis in the match, which our performance analysis does, and feedbacks to the players. And there's new research coming out by Paul Bradley and his team, which I think will be the next era in terms of how the contextualizing the data for physical forward movements, backward movements, sprinting, attacking, sprinting, defending, transition movements, how that physical data then contextualized in terms of the sprint. So what the breakdown is of that component, which again will really fit in with the game model, and I believe will be the next era. And I would suggest people having a look at that research by Paul Bradley, which is just starting to come out just now. Okay, and then just the sprint performance for me is a high area we should be looking at in terms of our game model. So it's the breakdown per players. The players' names, again, are blacked out at the bottom, but just shows you the variation. The white players, we look for a target of 300 meters for a match, 90 minutes. And for central players, we look at 200 meters as a target. So we'll show you the players breakdown there in terms of meters and efforts with the black dot. So finally, how does that all tie into a performance model? So really, essentially for me, the purpose of the performance model is to enhance and develop the team's performance and the players' performance and integration of the tactical and physical methodologies. And it's the ability of the club and staff to adopt such a model and apply this model to give the club a higher potential to have an impact on performance over a longer period of time. I also believe it can have an impact financially on the club through player sales. And the final graph there for me is really how that impact over time can happen. We want to have the green line, which is a dynamical stability and growth over time. Okay, and you'll see the other lines here, and you'll know clubs that do this. Either players that listen in the moment who've played at clubs or other practitioners that listen in. You'll know clubs that will be going unstable and fluctuation in the orange. You'll know players that are unstable, linear, and decrease over time. And you'll know the stable clubs out there who have the same performance, and that'll be due to their own methodology or financial impact. At this club, we do try to increase the development of performance over time, and we believe the performance model helps us do that, and the data will support that. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions. I put my Twitter there if anyone wants to contact me on Twitter. They have any questions after the webinar, but certainly we can go into some questions now if there's any, Patrick.
Cheers, Ian. All a bit of feedback there. Thanks a million for that. So obviously really appreciate you going into such detail and being so open with your data, first and foremost. No one I suppose can accuse you guys of gathering data for the sake of gathering data. You're
no.
No. Applying your data, and I'm sure nobody would like to be accused of that, but no, clearly not happening at Ludogorets. Was also really interested in that the stat you had up of about maybe a 10% increase in your meters per minute and your sprint distance when you go to Europe. And it's something that anecdotally I've heard an awful lot of when I visit clubs, clubs that have played in Europe and have got a shock almost at the input that's required of them. What other, would you ever consider using live data in game, or does that have any in what you guys do?
Yeah, we have used it before. Patrick, but I think for me the question is, what performance decision am I going to make by using the live in matches? For me at the moment, I can't get my head around how I'll impact performance by using live. What I do live is cut it into segments in the match to try and look at when we are at our sort of peak physically in terms of the meter per minute intensively, and look at that in terms of the video recording and link it back to the video. So is there times where we're going through high transitions, or is there times where we are really in phase 2 of building up and we have a lot of overlaps, and how the data for that period of time relates to the game model, and give that sort of feedback to the coaches. But in terms of live, we don't really use it at the moment, but I have used it and do use it ad hocly to try and get my head round and work with the coach of, can we make a performance decision based on what we do live, or is there something I can answer for you in terms of a coach that you want to know physical data live?
Okay, perfect. Thanks a million for that, Ian. And I know it's late over there, so I won't hold you longer, but thanks a million.
No worries. Okay, Patrick, thanks very much.
Cheers.